What's up, everyone? So today's video is going to be on Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which she published in 1826. I read this book in summer 2020, and I rated it 3.75 out of 5 stars, although, like, ever since I gave that rating, I've always kind of been a little bit torn about whether, is it a 4-star read? Is it 3 point whatever? And I think for books like this, the star rating system, doesn't really, I guess, cover it or express kind of like the complicated feelings I had for this book. And actually, that's what I had mentioned as well in my Iron Heel video for The Iron Heel by Jack London, where I wanted to kind of do a couple of videos on books I had read in 2020 that I rated initially under 4 stars, as well as books that on Goodreads, their average rating is under 4 stars. In this case, this book is actually significantly under 4 stars. It might even be under 3.5 stars, but personally, that Goodreads rating did not reflect how I felt about this book. I really enjoyed this book, definitely very atmospheric, and especially in the summer of 2020 when I was reading it, it was kind of like a cathartic read as well. But anyways, let's dive into The Last Man. As far as genre goes, The Last Man is existentialist, anti-romantic, apocalyptic fiction, and it's also got Gothic influences in its writing style as well. I think before going further, I'll just mention that from my perspective, it's important to understand the context of Mary Shelley's life at the time that she was writing this book. I think understanding that context makes it more of an emotional read and really gives you a sense of the bleak existential nihilism that kind of is really at the soul of this book. So at this point in her life, Mary Shelley was grieving the loss of her husband, Percy Shelley. As many of you might know, he drowned at the age of 29 years old in a boating accident. Mary herself at the time was 24 years old. Percy's death happened around 4 years before the publication of this book. And 2 years after Percy's death, Mary lost another friend and member of their kind of core group of authors or artists that they had. So Lord Byron also died 2 years before the publication of this book. And while writing this book, Mary at this point she's living as a young widow. She's around 24, 25 years old. She's a single mother to a 2-year-old son who's also named Percy. So if you hear me mentioning multiple Percys, it's Percy, her son, as well as Percy, her husband. So with that said, she wasn't a stranger to grief and loss in her life at this time. Before the birth of her surviving son, Percy, she lost 3 other children, either in early infancy or in early childhood. She also experienced a life-threatening miscarriage only a few months before Percy died, or Percy Shelley, her husband. Not long before the birth of Percy, her son, Mary's other son, William, died of malaria at the age of 3 years old when the family had relocated to Italy. And his death is really what seems to have sent Mary into a deep, deep depression. Before William's death, she had already lost 2 daughters, one who was born prematurely, and then the other daughter died of illness, also while the family was relocating to Italy. William's death really seemed to be what crushed her, though, and it seemed to make her lose all hope. And so by all accounts, at this point, she's becoming very emotionally distanced from other people in her life, and is really struggling with his death. So when Percy, her son, was born, she became very, very afraid of losing him as well, which is completely understandable given everything that she endured. She was at this point essentially living in extreme fear of losing her son, Percy, too. Then when Percy was only 2 years old, of course, then Mary loses her husband, Percy Shelley, to the boating accident. So needless to say, Mary, at the time of writing The Last Man, is feeling as though she's lost almost everything in her life. She's deathly afraid of losing her remaining child and family member. As some of you might know, Mary also lost her mother at a very young age, actually only a few weeks after Mary herself was born. So she dealt with a lot of loss, a lot of death in her life, and this novel is very much a testament to that, I guess, a tribute to that. I thought I'd also read just quickly the first sentence of the introduction here. Introduction before the book starts off. So, "The last man," wrote Mary Shelley in her journal in May 1824. "Yes, I may well describe that solitary being's feelings. Feeling myself as the last relic of a beloved race, my companions extinct before me." So here again, she's talking about the losses that she's had in her friend group, as well as the children that she's lost. A lot of the main characters in The Last Man are based on Mary's own friends. So Adrian is based on her husband Percy Shelley, especially a very idealized version of him. Perdita is based on Mary's half-sister Claire Clairmont. Raymond is very clearly Lord Byron. And Mary writes herself primarily into the tragic main character of Lionel Verney. But I would also argue that there are aspects of Mary that she writes not only into Lionel, but his wife Idris, and his sister Perdita as well. And especially when you consider some of the events that happen later on in the book around loss, tragedy, and that sort of thing, you can really see how she's done that. In many respects, she really is unloading her memories, her nostalgia, her joys, along with the crushing fears, experiences of loss and grief that she's had, into this book, as well as the fate of her characters. So what is this book actually about? As I mentioned in the beginning, this is apocalyptic fiction, but it isn't really the sort of apocalyptic fiction that we're used to reading today. Also, this book is supposed to be set in the distant future. It's actually set at the end of our own century, but Mary isn't really concerned about predicting technological innovations or anything like that, so much as telling the story of a distant apocalypse and the collapse of humanity. I should also mention some of the criticisms I've seen is that even though she is setting her story in the late 21st century, some folks kind of take issue with the fact that she doesn't really make any effort or doesn't seem to really try to predict any kind of new technology or a different world than the current one that we're living in, or that she was living in then, not that we're living in now. I would argue that given the context of when Mary was writing this, we're talking again the 1820s, predicting new technologies and societies that were drastically different from her own would not be something, I would argue, that authors during that time, it's not something that would really have been relevant, or something that would be in the same, like I think today we're more likely to think like, oh, the future, there's going to be like, you know, even in like the 60s, we're like, oh, you know, the 2000s, we're going to have like flying cars and all that kind of thing. Or the way we write sci-fi today, we predict all sorts of like drastically different technology or even forms of government and that kind of thing. I think in the context of the 1820s, it makes sense to me that Mary is not really predicting a world with like drastically different tech than what she had there. And I think if you think of the context of even like the last thinking of the last 500 years from there, from previous to the 1820s, that would make sense, honestly. Like she would have thought, yeah, there'll be some social changes, there'll be some technological changes, but I don't think at that point she had necessarily reason to think like the world is going to be a totally different place. Regardless, I do think the main point of this book, though, is not about predicting the makeup of a future world so much as looking at a tragedy, looking at a group of friends, the decline of a group of friends, and the decline of humanity. So in the first half of the book, and I think that's probably why there are some Goodreads reviews that talk about this book being boring, nothing happens, blah, 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 is that the first half of this book, other than a little bit of foreshadowing, you don't really see much mention of plagues, apocalypses, or anything like that. The first half of the book, we see kind of the the birth and evolution, I guess, of a group of friends. We see some social issues coming up, like abolishing the aristocracy is a major political issue that's being debated at the time. We see the ongoing struggle for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire. One thing I should say as well is that I think this book will probably be appealing to a specific kind of reader, or a reader with very specific tastes. I think if you're someone who prefers very fast-paced plots, or just very focused plots and narratives that are you kind of see in more common in more modern fiction from the mid-20th century onward, then this book probably won't meet those expectations. I think if you're not a fan of long meandering descriptions and interludes or wordier prose similar to what you see in Gothic fiction by authors like Anne Radcliffe, then it's possible that you'll find it boring. Personally, I really love kind of rambling prose that you see in a lot of Georgian and Victorian Gothic fiction. So for me, this was really great. I just find it feels very rich and very vivid, and yeah, I thought that was the case here as well. But yeah, to give a basic premise again as far as what this book is about, we have our tragic hero Lionel Verney and his sister Perdita, and they're born into poverty because of their father's debts, and basically what's perceived as a betrayal of friendship. By the time Lionel is 5, the two children have been orphaned. In the early chapters, we're told about Lionel and Perdita's youths and how their dispositions have been impacted by the tragedies and the realities of their young lives too. And then one day, Lionel meets the noble and principled Adrian, who is a member of the royal family Lionel previously detested. So again, a reminder that Adrian is a stand-in for Percy, Lionel a stand-in for Mary. But anyways, Lionel basically comes to worship Adrian. Adrian opens his eyes to new ideas, philosophies, a new existence. Before meeting Adrian, Lionel was basically a shepherd. He spent most of his days kind of roaming around, causing trouble, hurting, keeping sheep, that kind of thing. So Adrian kind of exposes him to philosophy, to literature, to new ideas that he had never been exposed to before. During the early book, we do get to see a lot of the development of their friendships, their transgressions, the story of their circle of friends that really does closely mirror Mary's own friend group. So Mary, Percy, Lord Byron, and among others. I originally read this book in the summer of 2020, and at the time it felt very chilling, just given everything happening in the world at that time. Along with the eventual plague that breaks out across the world, she also tells us about strange weather events and other signs of apocalypse. So we're hearing about extreme weather that today we associate with the climate crisis. So droughts, famines, storms, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. But in The Last Man, these events take on more of a biblical connotation. It wouldn't have been until later on in the 19th century that scientists would even start talking about climate change as the result of human industrialization. So despite the similarities to some of the things we're experiencing today, Mary obviously wasn't referencing climate change as we know it. Even so, I still found it a very eerie feeling reading her novel, just set in our own century, telling about the story of a plague, as well as climate devastation that brings about the end of humanity. I think what continued to feed into that eerie feeling was the descriptions of the impact of that plague on societies and social responses to it. So we're shown political and social reactions to the spread, like closing borders to try to keep the plague out, English people abroad rushing back home, again, as borders are closing. Countless people were unable to pay rent. The businesses are shuttering. Trade is kind of closing down. There's fears about food shortages. There's quarantines and all that kind of thing happening in this book. So slowly we go from seeing the plague as a problem in distant nations that the English people won't believe will ever reach them, to seeing it creeping closer and closer and closer. So as the news breaks out that the plague has now arrived in France, you really start to feel that rising fear and anxiety. Like now at this point, it's in a neighboring country, it's right on the doorstep, and people start to panic. There's one scene that I remember being pretty emotional and very, very chilling in a lot of ways. And it takes place in a public theater where they're performing Macbeth. And at that time, it's just the way both the actors and the audience are suddenly joined together in their sorrow, and that sorrow is being expressed through the play. So it's at, at one point, the play itself, the actors feel like they're no longer actors, they're no longer putting on a play. The audience is no longer just watching something make believe. At some point, you see that connection between the audience and the actors, and then there's just that shared communal experience of a massive tragedy that at one point just turns the whole performance into a very emotional experience for everyone. And I think with the scene in the public theater as well is it's just such a normal thing. People, there's a devastating plague approaching. People are terrified. They're going out to a public theater to try to forget about that. It's escapism. They just want to go watch this play. But the kind of that phantom of that plague just follows them into that theater. And like I said, it turns that escapist experience into that collective expression of grief. And as the book goes on, it really dives into that existential nihilism. There's a growing acceptance of human insignificance, the growing understanding that just like any other species, we too can be completely obliterated, that despite the great achievements that humanity has achieved, those achievements really may eventually amount to nothing but dust and ruin, to eventually be retaken by nature, essentially. And in that respect, it does share a bit with the sentiments behind Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, Look on my works, ye mighty in despair, especially towards the end of the book. Even during Mary's time, there was that belief in humanity as the most dominant of all species, as having a divine right to rule over nature and other species, that we have control over our surroundings. And that belief has often led us to believe that we as a species aren't indestructible, that we aren't necessarily vulnerable to nature or to these kinds of occurrences. Even if a large portion of humanity is wiped out, we tell ourselves that still our species will always persist and always prevail. Mary is in many ways crushing the belief in human exceptionalism in many ways, and her book really shows just how vulnerable humanity can be. A lot of apocalyptic stories, despite being fairly depressing, still carry underlying themes of human resilience and survival. They often feature people doing horrible things to survive, or may even end with, the bad guys winning out in the end over like the moral good guys. But those bad guys, even if they are bad guys, still fit into the story of human resilience, human adaptation, and humanity may degrade back into oppressive structures and worldviews, into brutality, but still it persists, even in darkness. What Mary Shelley's doing here crushes even that shred of, I don't know if you want to call it optimism or not, but it really embraces the idea of lastness, of having, of being the last person alive. As far as what I didn't like about this book, this is going to be very short because there isn't really anything that I didn't like about it. I can't really think about anything that I didn't like. But as far as why I was torn around the rating, I think part of it is that when I rate something 4 out of 5 stars or 5 stars, I usually feel more deeply connected with the main character or the characters. And as much as this book was an emotional read in many ways, a cathartic read in many ways, I guess I didn't feel like I had the same kind of connection with Lionel as I would usually have in characters in 4 or 5 star reads. So yeah, but at the same time, I still found this book extremely beautifully written, and I found the story and the themes very relevant, very emotional, like I said, in many respects, very cathartic. I've still been tempted since originally finishing this to rate it that way as a 4 star read, so I don't know. The star rating system doesn't really work for me, I think, for this book. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about it because I don't often see people talk about this either on Reddit or BookTube or elsewhere online. So I kind of wanted a chance to gush a little bit about it, talk a little bit about it, maybe encourage others with similar tastes to check it out. Like I said, if you're into, I think especially for people very into late 18th century, early 19th century Gothic stuff, a lot of Georgian and Victorian Gothic prose, if you're into that, um, is probably a predictor for how much or if you do enjoy this book or not. But yeah, thanks for thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.